There's nothing more precious than a child's life hanging in the balance. Every grandparent knows the fear that grips your heart when a little one goes missing. Walter Jenkins thought his days of saving lives were over at 72. The retired forest ranger had his daughter's golden retriever Scout for the holidays and expected quiet winter days at his mountain cabin. But one frozen December morning, Scout runs into the woods and comes back frantic. The dog tugs at Walter's coat, leading him deep into the snow. There, Walter finds a young girl unconscious and bleeding. As he carries her small body to warmth and safety, he realizes this is no ordinary lost child. She has no identification, and no missing persons report matches her description. Yet she knows these remote mountains better than most locals ever. And good. What secret is a 10-year-old hiding in these frozen woods? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Walter Jenkins had always been most comfortable in the silence of his own company. At 72, he found the world had grown too loud, too fast, too complicated for a man who measured time by the changing seasons rather than the relentless and tick of clocks. His log cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, 3 miles up a winding dirt road that most folks gave up on after the first sharp turn. The isolation suited him just fine. The cabin itself told the story of a life lived with purpose. Hand-hewn logs, now weathered to a silver grey, bore the marks of Walter's own axe from 30 years past. Margaret had insisted on the wide front porch, claiming she needed a place to watch the sunrise with her morning coffee. Now that porch held only one rocking chair, the other stored away in the shed, where Walter couldn't see it every day. Inside, the walls displayed a lifetime of service to the forest. Certificates from the Park Service hung beside black and white photographs of younger rangers standing proudly next to massive trees they'd helped protect. In the corner of his bedroom, dresser tucked beneath folded flannel shirts, lay his ranger badge, tarnished now but still solid in its brass authority. He hadn't looked at it in months. The phone call from Sarah had come on a Tuesday evening in mid-December, her voice carrying that familiar edge of hurried obligation. "Dad, I know this is short notice, but I need you to watch Scout for 2 weeks. Michael's parents want us to join them in Hawaii for Christmas, and you know how they feel about dogs on planes." Walter had gripped the phone tighter, staring out at the snow beginning to dust his windowsill. "Sarah, I don't know anything about taking care of a dog. Maybe you could board him somewhere." Her dad. Scout's a female, and she's family. The pause stretched long enough for Walter to hear his daughter's sigh. "Look, I know things have been difficult since Mom died, but Scout is really gentle. She just needs food, water, and someone to let her outside. That's it." The truth was, Walter hadn't seen his daughter in person for nearly 6 months. Their conversations had dwindled to duty calls on holidays and birthdays, each one leaving, him feeling more like a stranger in his own family. Margaret had been the bridge between them, smoothing over Walter's gruff edges and Sarah's impatience with translation and understanding. Without her, they seemed to speak different languages. "When would you need to drop her off?" Walter had asked, already knowing he couldn't refuse. "Tomorrow morning, if that's okay. I'll bring her food and everything she needs." The next morning arrived grey and bitter, with the kind of cold that made the trees crack like gunshots in the distance. Sarah's SUV crunched up the gravel drive exactly at 9, as punctual as she'd always been. Walter watched from his kitchen window as she opened the back door, and a golden blur bounded out into the snow. Scout was 3 years old, Sarah had explained, a rescue dog they'd adopted as a puppy. She had the classic golden retriever look, thick, and coat the color of autumn leaves, intelligent brown eyes, and a tail that never seemed to stop moving. But there was something different about her energy, a restless quality that made Walter think of wild things barely contained by domestication. "She's used to a big yard," Sarah said, setting down a bag of dog food and a box of supplies. "Just let her run around outside whenever she wants. She's good about coming back. Walter had nodded, feeling suddenly awkward in his own doorway. His daughter looked tired, older than her 43 years. Lines had appeared around her eyes that he didn't remember, and her blonde hair had been cut shorter, more practical. She wore the uniform of busy professionals everywhere, dark coat, sensible boots, phone constantly buzzing in her pocket. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Really doing?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment he considered telling her the truth, that some mornings he sat in bed for an hour just trying to find a reason to get up, that he'd taken to talking to Margaret's photograph during dinner, that the silence of the forest he'd once loved now felt like judgment for all the words he'd never said. Instead he shrugged. "I'm fine. Keeping busy." Sarah's smile was gentle but sad. "Mum always said you kept your worries locked up tighter than Fort Knox." She hugged him goodbye, a quick embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and city air. Scout watched from the porch as the SUV disappeared down the mountain road. Her ears perked forward and her head tilted in a way that made Walter think she was already calculating the dimensions of her temporary new world. The first day passed quietly. Enough. Scout explored the property with methodical thoroughness, nose to the ground, mapping every scent and landmark. Walter watched her from his kitchen window, noting how she moved with purpose, rather than the playful randomness he expected from a pet. She reminded him more of the working dogs he'd known during his ranger days, animals with jobs to do and the intelligence to do them well. By evening, Scout had claimed a spot on the rug in front of the fireplace. Walter found her there after washing his dinner dishes, lying with her chin on her paws, watching him with those steady brown eyes. For a moment, the cabin felt less empty than it had in months. "Well," Walter said aloud, feeling foolish but somehow compelled to fill the silence. "I suppose you're wondering what kind of operation I run here." Scout's tail thumped twice against the floor, and Walter took it as encouragement. "Not much excitement, I'm afraid. I get up at dawn, make coffee, check the weather. Sometimes I walk. Down to the mailbox, though the mail doesn't come but 3 times a week up here. Evenings I read, mostly books about places I've already been." He settled into his leather chair, the one Margaret had bought him for his retirement. Scout's eyes tracked his movement, alert but not anxious. "Your mama probably told you I used to be a forest ranger. 30 years of it, stationed right here. In these mountains. Back then I knew every trail, every creek, every family, living within 50 miles. Walter's voice grew softer, taking on the rhythm of memory. "Had to know them all, you understand. When people got lost or hurt in the wilderness, I was the one they called." Scout shifted slightly, settling deeper into the rug, but maintaining her watchful posture. Pulled more than a few folks out of situations they never should have gotten into. City people mostly, coming up here thinking the mountains are like some kind of theme park. They don't understand that the wilderness doesn't care about your schedule or your GPS or your fancy hiking boots. It's got its own rules, and if you don't respect them, well..." Walter paused, remembering faces and names he hadn't thought about in years. "Let's just say I've seen what can happen when people underestimate these mountains." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the log walls. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. Walter had always found comfort in that sound, but tonight it seemed to carry an edge of restlessness that made him glance toward the windows. Margaret, my wife, she understood the mountains better than most people who were born here, had this way of reading the weather, the animal signs, like she was part of the forest herself. Walter's voice caught slightly. "She died last spring. Cancer. Fought it for 2 years before it finally won." Scout's ears had pricked forward at the mention of Margaret's name, as if she recognized something in Walter's tone. "Sarah thinks I should move to town, maybe get one of those retirement community places with activities and neighbors who check on you. But I can't leave here. This cabin, these woods, it's where Margaret and I built our life, where we were happiest." The confession surprised him. He hadn't spoken those words aloud before, hadn't even fully admitted to himself how deeply the roots of memory held him to this place. Scout rose from her spot on the rug and padded over to Walter's chair. Without ceremony, she laid her head on his knee, her warm weight solid and reassuring. Walter found his hand moving automatically to stroke her ears, the gesture as natural as breathing. "Well now," he murmured, "I suppose you're not quite what I expected." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past the porch light. Walter felt Scout's body tense slightly under his hand, her head lifting to focus on something beyond the walls of the cabin. Her ears swiveled, like radar dishes, tracking sounds he couldn't hear. "What is it, girl?" Scout remained alert for another moment, then seemed to relax, settling back down beside his chair. But Walter noticed how her eyes stayed fixed on the front door, and how her breathing had changed from the deep rhythm of rest to the shallow alertness of a sentry on duty. For the first time in months, Walter felt a stirring of the old instincts that had served him well during his ranger days, the sense that something was shifting in the familiar patterns of his world. That change was coming whether he welcomed it or not. He looked down at Scout, noting the intelligence in her steady gaze, and wondered what she knew that he didn't. The night settled around them, bringing the kind of deep quiet that only existed in places far from civilization. But beneath that, silence. Walter sensed something else, a tension in the air like the pressure drop before a storm. Scout felt it too, her ears occasionally twitching toward sounds that existed just beyond the threshold of human hearing. Whatever was coming, Walter realized they would face it together. Walter woke to the sound of frantic barking, the kind of urgent alarm that cut through sleep like a blade. Grey dawn light filtered through his bedroom curtains, and the digital clock beside his bed read 6:47 a.m. Scout's barks echoed from somewhere near the front of the cabin, each one sharp with distress. He pulled on his robe and heavy slippers, joints protesting the sudden movement. The hardwood floor felt ice-cold, even through the thick soles, as he made his way to the living room. Scout stood at the front door, her entire body rigid with tension, alternating between sharp barks and a high whining sound Walter had never heard her make before. "Easy, girl. What's got you so worked up?" But Scout wasn't interested in comfort. The moment Walter approached the door, she turned and looked directly at him, her brown eyes wide and urgent. She barked once more, then ran to the door and back. To Walter, then to the door again, her message unmistakable. Walter peered through the front window. Snow had fallen heavily during the night, transforming the familiar landscape into something that looked alien in the pale morning light. Everything appeared normal. The same pine trees, the same rocky outcroppings, the same narrow trail that led down the mountain. But Scout's agitation was infectious, setting Walter's nerves on edge with its intensity. All right, let me get dressed and we'll take a look." But Scout wasn't willing to wait. She planted herself directly in front of the door and began barking again, this time with a rhythm that sounded almost like words. Bark, 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 over and over, like Morse code or some desperate attempt at communication. Walter had spent enough time in the wilderness to trust animal instincts. Dogs, especially intelligent ones like Scout, could sense things humans missed. Changes in air pressure, sounds beyond human hearing, scents that carried messages across miles of forest. If Scout thought something was wrong, something probably was. He dressed quickly in layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirt, wool sweater, and his heaviest winter coat. His boots were waterproof and insulated, designed for serious mountain weather. As he laced them up, Scout's barking grew more frantic, punctuated now by scratching at the door. "Okay, girl, show me what's got you so worried." The moment Walter opened the door, Scout bolted into the snow. She ran about 20 yards down the trail, then stopped and looked back, barking once. When Walter didn't immediately follow, she ran back to him, grabbed the sleeve of his coat in her teeth and tugged. I'm coming." The snow was deeper than Walter had realized, nearly knee-high in some drifts. Scout seemed to float. Across the surface, her wide paws distributing her weight like natural snowshoes. Walter followed more slowly, his boots crunching through the crust with each step. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, and his breath came out in great white clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. Scout led him away from the main trail, cutting through a stand of aspen trees that Walter knew well from his ranger days. This was rough country, full of hidden ravines and sudden drop-offs that could be treacherous even in good weather. With snow covering the familiar landmarks, it would be easy for someone to get lost or hurt. After about 10 minutes of steady climbing, Scout's behavior changed. She slowed down, her nose working overtime as she tested the air. Her tail, which had been high and flagged with urgency, dropped low and began to wag in short, nervous movements. She was tracking something now, following a scent trail that led deeper into the woods. Walter followed, his own senses heightened by Scout's obvious distress. The silence of the snow-covered forest felt heavy and unnatural. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered in the trees. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving only the sound of their footsteps and Scout's occasional soft whine. Then Scout stopped completely, her entire body going rigid. She was staring at something ahead, partially hidden by a fallen log and a drift of snow. Walter moved up beside her and felt his heart skip a beat. A small mitten, bright red against the white snow, lay abandoned near the base of a large pine tree. But it wasn't just dropped. It was torn, as if it had been pulled off in a struggle or caught on something sharp. Dark stains marked the snow around it, stains that Walter's experienced eye immediately recognized as blood. Jesus, Walter breathed, his ranger instincts taking over. He approached the mitten carefully, scanning the ground for other signs. More blood, scattered in a rough line leading away from the tree. And there, barely visible under a thin layer of fresh snow, the outline of a small boot print. Scout had moved ahead again, following the blood trail, with her nose nearly touching the ground. She was completely focused now, all her attention directed towards something Walter couldn't yet see. Then she stopped and let out a sound Walter had never heard from a dog before, a low, mournful cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Walter hurried forward and saw what had stopped. Scout cold. 20 feet away, curled against the base of another tree, was a small figure, a child wearing a dark blue coat and jeans, lying motionless in the snow. One hand was bare, the hand that had lost the red mitten, and Walter could see it was an unnatural shade of pale blue. Training took over. Walter covered the distance to the child in 3 quick strides, dropping to his knees beside the small form. A girl, he could see now, maybe 10 years old, with dark hair that had escaped from a wool cap. Her face was pale as the snow around her, lips tinged with blue. But when Walter pressed his fingers to her neck, he felt the faint flutter of a pulse. "She's alive," he said aloud, whether to Scout or to himself he wasn't sure. "She's alive, but just barely." Hypothermia was the immediate threat. The girl's core temperature had dropped dangerously low. Walter could tell by the shallow, irregular breathing and the way her skin felt cold even through her clothes. But there was something else. Blood had soaked through the left side of her coat, and when Walter carefully opened the jacket, he found a gash along her ribs that would need immediate attention. "How long have you been out here, sweetheart?" Walter murmured as he quickly assessed her condition. The blood around the wound had clotted and frozen, which told him the injury wasn't fresh. She'd been lying here for hours, maybe all night. Scout whined softly, pressing close to the girl's other side. Instinctively, the dog seemed to understand that warmth was critical. Her thick coat and body heat would help, but Walter knew they needed to get the child inside as quickly as possible. Lifting her was a challenge. At 72, Walter wasn't as strong as he'd once been, and the girl, though small, was dead weight in his arms. But adrenaline and years of wilderness training served him well. He managed to settle her against his chest, her head tucked under. his chin, and began the careful journey back toward the cabin. Scout ran ahead, breaking a trail through the deep snow and occasionally looking back to make sure Walter was following. The trip that had taken 10 minutes to hike down took nearly 20 to climb back up, with Walter stopping frequently to rest and check on the girl's breathing. Halfway home, she stirred slightly in his arms and mumbled something he couldn't quite catch. Her voice was so soft it was barely a whisper, but the words sounded like the old place, and they're gone. Then she went quiet again, her breathing so shallow Walter had to watch her chest to make sure she was still alive. By the time they reached the cabin, Walter's arms ached and his back was screaming in protest. But the warmth that hit them as he shouldered through the front door felt like salvation. Scout immediately went to her spot by the fireplace and began nudging the burned logs with her nose, as if trying to restart the fire herself. Walter carried the girl to the couch and began the careful process of warming her up. Too fast could be dangerous. He'd learned that during his wilderness first aid training years ago. Gradual warming was key. He removed her wet outer clothes, wrapped her in dry blankets, and built up the fire until the cabin filled with comfortable heat. As he worked, cleaning and bandaging the wound on her side, Walter found himself studying the girl's face. She was pretty in the way children often are, with clear skin and long dark eyelashes, but there was something else, something that nagged at the edge of his memory. She looked familiar somehow, though he was certain he'd never seen her before. More puzzling were the clothes she wore underneath her winter coat. Hand-sewn, he realized, examining the careful stitching and simple design. Not store-bought, but made by someone with considerable skill. Her boots, too, were unusual. Good. Quality leather, but with a style Walter hadn't seen in years. Who was this child, and how had she ended up alone and injured in the middle of nowhere? Walter settled into his chair to wait for her to wake up. Scout curled protectively at the foot of the couch. Outside, snow continued to fall, and Walter couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his quiet, ordered world was about to change. The girl slept for 14 hours straight, her breathing gradually becoming deeper and more regular as warmth returned to her small body. Walter dozed fitfully in his chair, waking every hour to check her pulse and adjust the blankets. Scout never left her post at the foot of the couch, occasionally lifting her head to sniff the air around the child, as if monitoring her condition, through senses Walter couldn't access. When the girl finally opened her eyes, it was late afternoon, and snow was still falling beyond the cabin windows. Walter had been reading, or trying to read, when he heard a soft rustling from the couch. He looked up to find a pair of large, dark eyes watching him with an expression of wary confusion. "Easy there," Walter said gently, setting down his book. "You're safe. My name is Walter, and this is Scout." He gestured toward the golden retriever, whose tail had begun a tentative wagging. "She's the one who found you." The girl's eyes moved from Walter to Scout, and back again. She tried to sit up, winced at the pain from her bandaged side, and settled back against the cushions. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where am I?" "You're in my cabin, about 3 miles up Mountain View Road. Scout found you in the woods this morning, unconscious and pretty badly hurt." Walter kept his voice calm and reassuring, the way he'd learned to speak to frightened hikers during his ranger days. "Do you remember what happened to you?" The girl was quiet for a long moment, her forehead creased in concentration. Finally, she shook her head. "I remember being cold, so cold, and there was something chasing me, but I can't—" She stopped, looking frustrated. "I can't remember." "That's all right. Sometimes when people get very cold or hurt, their memory gets fuzzy for a while. It might come back to you gradually." Walter leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell me your name?" Another pause, longer this time. The girl's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where Walter could see the edge of something beneath her borrowed shirt, a necklace or pendant of some kind. I think they called me Hope, but that might not be my real name." "Hope is a beautiful name," Walter said. "We'll go with that for now. Hope, do you remember where you live, or how you ended up in the woods?" Hope closed her eyes, and Walter could see her struggling to access memories that seemed just out of reach. "There was a place," she said slowly. "Houses, but not like this one, and people, lots of people. But something happened, something bad. Fire, maybe. Everything was burning, and people were running and screaming." Her breathing had quickened, and Scout seemed to sense her distress. The dog rose from her spot and padded over to the couch, gently placing her head near Hope's hand. The girl's fingers automatically moved to stroke Scout's ears, and some of the tension left her face. "You don't have to remember everything right now," Walter assured her. "The important thing is that you're safe and warm. Are you hungry? When was the last time you ate something?" Hope considered this. "I don't know. A long time, I think. My stomach feels empty." Walter made his way to the kitchen, Scout following closely behind. As he heated up a can of soup and made some toast, he found himself studying the girl from the corner of his eye. There was something about her that didn't quite fit. Her speech patterns were oddly formal for a child her age, with none of the casual slang or modern references he'd expect. And her clothes, now that he looked at them more carefully, seemed to belong to a different era entirely. While the soup warmed, Walter pulled out the torn mitten Scout had found. Red wool, hand-knitted with a complex pattern that showed real skill. He'd seen mittens like this before, but not recently. His grandmother had made similar ones, back when people took the time to create beautiful, functional things by hand. "Hope," Walter called softly. "Is this yours?" The girl's eyes immediately focused on the mitten, and for the first time since she'd awakened, Walter saw a spark of recognition. "Yes," she said, reaching out for it. "Mama Sarah made it for me. She said red would be easy to see in the snow. If I ever got lost." "Mama Sarah is smart," Walter said, bringing her the soup on a tray. "Is she your mother?" Hope's brow furrowed again. "She took care of me, but she wasn't. I mean, I had different parents before I came to live with the community." She paused, looking confused. "Why can't I remember more clearly?" "Memory can be tricky after trauma," Walter explained, settling back into his chair. "Your mind might be protecting you from remembering things that were too frightening or painful. Sometimes those memories come back slowly when you feel safer." Hope ate the soup carefully, as if she wasn't quite sure she was allowed to have it. Walter noticed she held the spoon differently than most children, more like someone who'd learned to eat with handmade utensils rather than standard silverware. Everything about her suggested a life lived far outside the mainstream of modern society. After she'd finished eating, Hope seemed stronger and more alert. She sat up straighter on the couch, and Walter could see her taking in details of the cabin, the stone fireplace, the mounted photographs of forest scenes, the books lining the shelves. "You were a forest ranger," she said suddenly. "It wasn't a question. How did you know that?" "The pictures. And the way you move in the woods. I watched you when you carried me back. You know where to step, how to read the signs. Mama Sarah taught me to recognize people who understand the forest." Walter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Hope, where exactly did you live before? What kind of community?" But before Hope could answer, Scout's head shot up, her ears swiveling toward the front of the cabin. A moment later, Walter heard the distant sound of a vehicle making its way up the mountain road. The engine note was different from Sarah's. SUV, heavier, more powerful. Probably a truck with four-wheel drive, the kind law enforcement used in rough terrain. "Expecting company?" Hope asked, but Walter could hear a note of fear creeping into her voice. "No," Walter said, moving to the window. Through the falling snow, he could see headlights winding up the last stretch of road toward his cabin. "Hope, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you running from someone? Someone who might hurt you?" Hope's face went pale, and her hand moved again to the hidden pendant at her throat. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think maybe. Yes. But I can't remember who or why." The truck was getting closer, its headlights now clearly visible through the trees. Walter made a quick decision. "Come with me," he said, helping Hope to her feet. "We're going to put you in the back bedroom for now, just until I see who this is and what they want." As they moved toward the back of the cabin, Hope stumbled slightly, her legs still weak from her ordeal. Walter caught her arm to steady her, and something crinkled in the pocket of the jeans she was wearing. He looked down to see the corner of what appeared to be folded paper protruding from the pocket. "What's that?" Hope looked down and seemed surprised to see it. "I don't know. I didn't know I had anything in my pockets." She pulled out the paper and unfolded it carefully. Walter's breath caught as he saw what it was. A hand-drawn map, incredibly detailed, showing topographical features of the surrounding mountains. But these weren't areas marked on any official maps Walter knew. This showed hidden valleys, unmarked trails, and what appeared to be structures in places where no buildings should exist. The sound of the truck engine grew louder, and Walter knew they were almost out of time. "Hope, this map, did you draw this?" "I don't think so," she said, studying the careful lines and notations. "But I know these places. I know all of them." "How is that possible?" Outside, the truck had stopped, and Walter could hear doors slamming, multiple doors. More than one person then, and they were trying to move quietly through the snow toward his cabin. Scout's hackles had risen, and a low growl rumbled in her chest. Walter looked at the map in Hope's hands, at the detailed knowledge it represented, of areas that were supposed to be uninhabited wilderness, and felt the first stirring of understanding about what he might have gotten himself into. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. "Hope," he said quietly, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation about where you came from. But right now, I need you to hide. And I need you to stay hidden no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" Hope nodded, clutching the map to her chest. As Walter led her toward the back bedroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet retirement had just taken a turn towards something that would test every skill he'd learned in 30 years of dealing with wilderness emergencies. The only question was whether those skills would be enough to protect the mysterious child who had somehow wandered into his life. The knock on Walter's front door was firm and official, the kind of knock that expected to be answered promptly. Walter took a deep breath, composed his expression into what he hoped looked like ordinary annoyance at being disturbed, and opened the door. Two men stood on his porch, both wearing heavy winter coats and the kind of boots that suggested they were comfortable in rough terrain. The older one, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes, held up a badge. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm Sheriff Martinez, and this is Deputy Collins. We're following up on a missing person report. Mind if we come in?" Walter stepped aside, noting how both men's eyes immediately swept the interior of his cabin, taking in details with practiced efficiency. Scout watched them from her position near the fireplace, her body language alert but not aggressive. "Missing person," Walter said, settling into his chair and gesturing for the men to take seats on the couch where Hope had been lying just minutes before. "I haven't seen anyone up here in weeks. This isn't exactly a high-traffic area." Sheriff Martinez pulled out a notebook. "We're looking for a young girl, approximately 10 years old, dark hair, last seen wearing a blue winter coat. She disappeared from her foster home 3 days ago, and we have reason to believe she might have headed into the mountains." Foster home? Walter kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. Hope had mentioned a community, people who took care of her, but nothing about foster care or any official placement. "The Hendersons, down in Pine Valley," Deputy Collins added. "They've had the girl for about 6 months. She has a history of running away, apparently some kind of trauma from her previous situation. The Hendersons are worried sick." Walter frowned, genuinely confused now. Pine Valley was 40 miles away, and the Hendersons were a local family he'd known peripherally for years. Good people, the kind who might indeed take in foster children. But something about this story didn't match what Hope had told him about. Living in a community, about houses that weren't like his cabin, about people running from a fire. "What's the girl's name?" Walter asked. Sheriff Martinez consulted his notes. "Jennifer Henderson, though she sometimes goes by other names. She's had some memory issues since her original placement. The state removed her from what they believe was some kind of isolated religious group, but she's never been fully cooperative about providing details. Walter's coffee cup felt suddenly heavy in his hands. Religious group, isolated, memory issues. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't a clear one. Either Hope was this Jennifer Henderson, and her memories of the community were confused trauma responses, or someone was looking for a different girl entirely, and the timing was just unfortunate coincidence. "I'm sorry I can't help you," Walter said carefully. "Like I said, I haven't seen anyone, but I'll certainly keep an eye out." Deputy Collins had been studying the cabin during the conversation, and now his gaze fixed on something near the fireplace. "Nice dog," he said. "Golden retriever? She belongs to my daughter. I'm watching her for the holidays. Friendly looking. Does she stay close to home, or does she wander around the property?" Walter felt a prickle of unease. The question seemed casual, but there was something calculated about the way Collins was asking it. "She stays pretty close. Why? No reason. Just noticed some unusual tracks in the snow on our way up here. Looked like a large dog, but the pattern was odd, like it was leading something or someone through the woods." Sheriff Martinez shot his deputy a warning look, but the damage was done. Walter now knew they suspected his involvement, or at least wanted him to know they were watching. He decided to take a small risk. "Well, Scout did get out early this morning and came back pretty agitated. If you want to take a look around the property, you're welcome to. Maybe she found some trace of this missing girl." "That's generous of you, Mr. Jenkins," Martinez said, standing up. "Collins, why don't you take a walk around outside, see if you notice anything unusual?" After the deputy left, Martinez remained seated, his demeanor becoming more conversational. "You know, Walter, I remember when you used to work these mountains. You had a reputation for bringing people home safe when they got into trouble. That was a long time ago, not that long, and skills like that, they don't just disappear." Martinez leaned forward slightly. "If you did happen to encounter someone in need of help, a child, for instance, I know you'd want to do the right thing, but sometimes the right thing isn't as simple as it seems." Walter met the sheriff's eyes steadily. "Meaning? Meaning there are different kinds of danger. Sometimes the people looking for someone aren't the people that someone wants to be found. And by foster care, state custody, it's not always the safe haven it's supposed to be." The statement hung in the air between them, and Walter realized Martinez was telling him something important. The sheriff suspected Walter had found Hope, but he wasn't necessarily here to drag her back to an unwanted situation. He was testing Walter, trying to gauge whether the old ranger could be trusted to make the right decision for a vulnerable child. "Hypothetically speaking," Walter said slowly, "if someone did encounter a lost child, what would you recommend?" "Hypothetically, I'd recommend that person be very careful about who they trust. And I'd recommend they remember that sometimes the best way to protect someone is to make sure they're truly safe before making any official reports." Walter studied the sheriff's weathered face, seeing something there that reminded him of his own years in public service. The weight of making decisions that affected people's lives, the knowledge that bureaucracy didn't always serve justice. How long would someone have to make that determination? Depends on the circumstances. A day or two, maybe more, if the weather stays bad and communications are difficult. Martinez glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall steadily. These mountain roads can be treacherous. Sometimes it takes a while for news to get out. The front door opened, bringing a swirl of cold air and Deputy Collins stomping snow off his boots. "Didn't find much," he reported. "Lots of tracks, but most of them are pretty well filled in. Could be anything, deer, dogs, people. Hard to tell with all this fresh snow." Martinez stood up, pulling on his gloves. "Well, Walter, we appreciate your time. If you do see or hear anything unusual, you know how to reach us." "Of course." As the two men prepared to leave, Martinez paused at the door. "Oh, and, Walter, You might want to know that there are other people looking for this particular girl, federal people. They've been asking questions around town, but they're not being as forthcoming about their reasons as we are." After the sheriff's truck disappeared down the mountain road, Walter stood at his window for a long time, watching the snow fall and thinking about everything he'd just learned. Hope, or Jennifer, or whoever she really was, wasn't just a lost child. She was someone multiple agencies were actively seeking, and apparently not all of them had her best interests at heart. He made his way to the back bedroom where Hope was hiding. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still clutching the hand-drawn map, her face pale with anxiety. "It's all right," Walter said quietly. "They're gone." "Were they looking for me?" Walter sat down in the room's single chair, studying Hope's face carefully. "They were looking for someone. A girl named Jennifer Henderson, who went missing from a foster home 3 days ago. They think she might have come into the mountains." Hope's eyes widened. "Jennifer, that was one of my names. When they first took me from the community, they called me Jennifer because I couldn't remember my real name, but I was never with any foster family called Henderson." "What do you remember about being taken from the community?" Hope closed her eyes, concentrating. "Men in uniforms. They said the community was dangerous, that we weren't being taken care of properly. But that wasn't true. We were happy there. We had everything we needed. We grew our own food, made our own clothes, took care of each other." "What happened to the other people?" "They scattered when the authorities came. Some went deeper into the mountains, some probably went to other communities they knew about. But they separated the children from the adults, said we needed to be properly socialized." Hope's voice carried a bitterness that seemed too old for her years. "They put me with different families, but I kept running away because I wanted to go home." Walter looked at the map in her hands. "Hope, this map you had, it shows places I've never seen on any official survey. Are these locations from your community?" "Some of them. But others are places the community knew about, safe places, hidden, places where people could go if they needed to disappear for a while." She traced one of the marked areas with her finger. "This one here, it's called Peaceful Valley. There used to be a family living there, but they moved on years ago. The buildings are still there, though." "How far is it from here?" Hope studied the map, then looked toward the window as if taking bearings from the landscape outside. "Maybe 5 miles northeast, but it's hard to get to. You have to know the right trail, and even then, it's dangerous in winter." Walter felt a stirring of the old excitement that used to come with solving difficult problems in the wilderness. "Hope, I need to ask you something important. Do you want to go back to foster care? To the system that placed you with these different families?" "No," she said immediately. "I want to go home to find my people, but I don't know if any of them are still—" Her voice broke slightly. "What if they're all gone? What if I'm the only one left? Then we'll figure out what comes next. When we get to that point." Walter made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. "But first, I think we need to learn more about what really happened to your community and why federal agents are looking for you specifically." Hope looked up at him with something like hope flickering in her dark eyes. "You'll help me?" "I'll help you," Walter said, realizing as he spoke the words that he meant them completely. "But we need to be smart about this. There are people looking for you who might not have your best interests at heart, and we need to understand what we're dealing with before we make any moves." Scout appeared in the doorway, her presence somehow reassuring in the midst of all the uncertainty. She padded over to Hope and lay down beside the bed, positioning herself between the girl and the door as if standing guard. "Scout likes you," Walter observed. "Animals always like me," Hope said, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. "In the community, I help take care of all the animals, goats, chickens, even the wild ones that would come around looking for food." Walter found himself remembering Margaret's journal entries about her hiking trips, about her mysterious absences that he'd never questioned. Had she known about Hope's community? Had she been one of the people helping them stay hidden from a world that wanted to separate families and place children in institutions? "Hope," Walter said carefully, Did anyone in your community ever mention a woman named Margaret? Someone who might have helped you with medical supplies or other things you needed? Hope's face lit up with recognition. Margaret the helper. Yes, she came to see us sometimes. She brought medicine and books, and she always had stories about the outside world. Everyone loved her. She was one of the few outsiders who understood that we weren't doing anything wrong, just living the way we thought was right. Walter felt a warmth spread through his chest, mixed with a profound sadness. Margaret had indeed been keeping secrets from him, but they were the kind of secrets that made him proud to have shared his life with her. She had been protecting people who needed protection, helping families stay together in a world that seemed determined to break them apart. Margaret was my wife, Walter said quietly. Hope's eyes went wide. Your wife? But that means... She stopped, looking confused. She talked about her husband sometimes, said he was a forest ranger who protected the mountains, but she never said his name, never said where she lived. She was protecting both of us, Walter realized. If something went wrong, if the authorities found out what she was doing, she didn't want them to be able to trace it back to me. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling in complex patterns past the porch light. Walter looked at the map again, noting the careful detail with which each trail and landmark had been recorded. This was knowledge passed down through generations, the kind of intimate understanding of the land that only came from living in harmony with it for years. Hope, he said, I think it's time you told me everything you remember about what happened to your community, and then we're going to figure out how to get you safely back to your people, or at least to somewhere you can make your own choices. About your future, Hope nodded, clutching the map tighter. For the first time since she'd awakened in his cabin, she looked like she might actually believe that someone was on her side. That evening, Walter pulled out the wooden box he'd kept, hidden in his bedroom closet since Margaret's death. He'd avoided looking through her personal papers, telling himself he wasn't ready to face the reminders of their shared life. But Hope's revelations about Margaret the helper changed everything. If his wife had been secretly involved with Hope's community, there might be answers in her journals and notes. Hope sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the hand-drawn map spread out before her, while Scout maintained her watchful position nearby. Walter could hear Hope humming softly as she traced routes on the map, a melody he didn't recognize, but that somehow sounded ancient, like something passed down through generations. Hope, Walter called from the bedroom, did your community have special songs or music? Oh yes, she replied, her voice brightening. We had songs for everything, planting, harvesting, celebrating births, mourning deaths. Music was how we remembered our history and taught the children about our ways. Walter smiled, remembering how Margaret had often returned from her mysterious hikes, humming tunes he'd never heard before. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The wooden box contained 3 leather-bound journals, a collection of loose papers, and several small items wrapped in cloth. Walter opened the most recent journal first, dated just 2 years before Margaret's death. Her handwriting was still strong and clear, and the entries began innocuously enough. Notes about weather, plants she'd observed, wildlife sightings. But as Walter read further, he began to notice coded references that took on new meaning in light of what he now knew. Visited the Valley families today. The eldest is developing a persistent cough. Left the antibiotics and honey mixture we discussed. The children are thriving, especially the newest addition. She has Margaret's gift for understanding the language of growing things. Walter looked up at Hope. Did your community have someone with a cough? An older person who needed medicine? Hope nodded without looking up from her map. Elder Samuel. He'd had trouble breathing for months before Margaret the helper brought him medicine that made it better. She saved his life. Walter continued reading, finding entry after entry that documented Margaret's secret life as a medical provider and protector for the hidden community. She'd been supplying not just medicine, but books, news from the outside world, and warnings about increased government attention to isolated religious groups. One entry, dated 8 months before Margaret's death, made Walter's blood run cold. The Federal Task Force is expanding their search. Agent Morrison questioned me today about unusual activity in the mountain regions. I played dumb, but I could tell he was suspicious. The families need to prepare for the possibility of discovery. I've given them the emergency protocols we discussed, and I pray they never need to use them. Hope, Walter said quietly, what do you remember about federal agents coming to your community? Hope's humming stopped. She looked up from the map, her face troubled. It happened so fast. One day everything was normal, and the next day there were helicopters and trucks everywhere. They said we were being rescued from a dangerous cult, but we weren't in any danger. We were happy. What about the fire you mentioned earlier? Hope's hand stilled on the map. That was later, after they took us away and separated everyone. I heard some of the adults talking before they split us up. They said someone had gone back to the settlement to retrieve important things we'd left behind. But the buildings caught fire somehow, and 2 people died trying to save our records and belongings. Walter felt a surge of anger at the senseless loss. In trying to rescue a peaceful community, the authorities had destroyed it and caused the very tragedy they claimed to be preventing. He turned to another section of Margaret's journal, finding detailed maps and notes about escape routes and safe houses. His wife had been thinking strategically, planning for the worst-case scenario. One map looked remarkably similar to the one Hope carried, showing hidden valleys and marked trails that didn't appear on any official survey. Among the loose papers, Walter found something that made his heart skip, a birth certificate for a girl named Hope Morning Star, born in Mountain Valley Community, parents listed as deceased. The date of birth matched the age Hope appeared to be, and there was a notation at the bottom. Emergency guardianship transferred to community elders per parents' final wishes. Hope, Walter said, his voice carefully controlled. What do you remember about your parents, your original parents, before the community took you in? Hope looked up, her expression growing distant. They died when I was very small. A car accident, I think. I don't remember them clearly, just feelings, being loved, being safe. The community took me in because my parents had been friends with them, and because they believed every child deserved a family, even if their blood family was gone. Walter studied the birth certificate. If this was authentic, then Hope hadn't been abducted or held against her will by the community. She had been orphaned and legitimately taken in by people who cared for her. The federal intervention had been based on fundamentally false assumptions. Hope, did anyone in the community ever mention keeping official papers, birth certificates, legal documents, things like that? Elder Samuel kept all the important papers in a special fireproof box. He said it was crucial to maintain our legal rights, even if we chose to live differently from most people. Hope's face grew sad. I suppose all of that burned in the fire. Walter held up the birth certificate. Not all of it. Hope scrambled to her feet and came over to look at the document. Her eyes widened as she read her name, her real name, for the first time in months. Hope Morning Star, she whispered. I had forgotten. After they took me away, they only called me Jennifer, said my real name was too unusual for school records. Your name is beautiful, Walter said, and according to this, you weren't illegally taken from your parents. You were placed with the community legally after your parents died. Hope sank into Margaret's old rocking chair, holding the birth certificate like it was made of gold. Does this mean I don't have to go back to foster care? That I can choose where I want to live? It means we have documentation that your placement with the community was legitimate. But I'm not a lawyer, Hope. We'll need to be careful about how we proceed. Walter returned to Margaret's journals, looking for more recent entries. What he found in the final pages made him understand the full scope of what they were facing. The task force is planning a major operation. Agent Morrison let slip that they're targeting not just our Valley family, but several other communities across the mountain region. They seem to believe there's some kind of coordinated resistance movement, which is absurd. These are just families trying to live peacefully according to their beliefs. But fear and misunderstanding are powerful forces. I've warned Samuel and the others to prepare for evacuation if necessary. God help us all. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before Margaret was diagnosed with cancer. Hope is asking questions about the outside world, wondering what it would be like to go to a regular school, to have friends her own age who aren't part of the community. Samuel thinks she's too young to make such decisions, but I see a bright, curious child who deserves to know all her options. I've promised to help her explore what's possible when she's ready. Every child should have the chance to choose their own path. Walter closed the journal, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Margaret had been preparing to help Hope navigate between two worlds, the traditional community that had raised her and the broader society that offered different opportunities. Her death had cut short those plans, leaving Hope to face that choice alone and unprepared. "Hope," Walter said, "I think I understand now why you were trying to get back to the mountains when Scout found you. But I also think there might be more to consider than just finding your community." Hope looked up. "From her birth certificate. What do you mean?" "I mean, Margaret was right. You deserve to know all your options. You can try to find your people, if any of them are still living in the old ways, or you can explore what life might be like in the outside world, but on your own terms, not as a ward of the state." "And you would help me with either choice?" Walter surprised himself with the certainty of his answer. "Yes, I would." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Walter found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he'd been a lonely retiree counting the hours until his daughter's dog went home. Now he was contemplating becoming guardian to a child he barely knew, helping her navigate between two very different worlds while keeping her safe from federal agents who might not understand the complexity of her situation. Scout raised her head suddenly, ears pricked toward the front of the cabin. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of another vehicle making its way up the mountain road. Walter and Hope exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Their quiet evening of discovery was about to be interrupted. "Again, hide the papers," Walter said quietly. "And Hope, no matter who this is or what they want, you don't exist until we know more about their intentions." Hope nodded, quickly gathering her birth certificate and the map. As she headed toward the back bedroom, Walter couldn't help but notice how naturally she moved through crisis, how calmly she responded to potential danger. These were skills learned through necessity, the survival instincts of a child who'd already faced more upheaval than most adults ever would. Whatever came next, Walter was determined that Hope Morningstar would finally have someone in her corner who understood that protecting her meant more than just keeping her safe. It meant preserving her right to choose her own future. The vehicle that pulled up to Walter's cabin was different from Sheriff Martinez's truck, sleeker, newer, with the kind of equipment mounted on top that suggested serious communication capabilities. Through the window, Walter watched 2 figures emerge from what appeared to be a black SUV with government plates. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents, their heavy coats failing to disguise the bulge of shoulder holsters underneath. Walter opened the door before they could knock, presenting himself as a cooperative mountain resident, rather than someone with something to hide. "Gentlemen," he said, noting how both men's eyes immediately swept the interior of his cabin. "Bit late for social calls, isn't it?" The older agent, a tall man with silver hair and cold gray eyes, displayed his credentials. "Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Chen. We're investigating reports of suspicious activity in this area, and we'd like to ask you a few questions." So this was the Morrison that Margaret had written about in her journals. Walter studied the man's face, seeing the kind of rigid certainty that often led to more harm than good in complex situations. Suspicious activity. Walter stepped aside to let them in, noting how Chen immediately positioned himself with a clear view of both the front door and the hallway leading to the back of the cabin. "Can't say I've noticed anything unusual, but I'll help if I can." Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed Walter a photograph. "We're looking for this girl. She's considered extremely dangerous, possibly brainwashed by an extremist religious cult that has been operating in these mountains for years." Walter looked at the photo, which clearly showed Hope, though she looked younger and her hair was longer. The image had the formal quality of an official identification photo, probably taken when she was first removed from the community. Dangerous. Walter couldn't keep the skepticism out of his voice. "She looks like a child. Children can be weapons in the hands of extremists," Morrison said flatly. "This particular girl has been trained in wilderness survival, possibly in guerrilla tactics, and she's escaped from federal custody 3 times. We have reason to believe she's attempting to reconnect with the terrorist cell that raised her." Walter felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "Terrorist cell? I thought you said religious cult." "The distinction is becoming increasingly irrelevant," Chen interjected. "These groups teach children to distrust authority, to view the federal government as an enemy, and to use primitive living skills to avoid detection. It's essentially domestic terrorism disguised as religious freedom. Have they actually committed any acts of terrorism?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "They've evaded federal jurisdiction, harbored fugitives from justice, and indoctrinated children in anti-government ideology. That's sufficient to classify them as a domestic threat." Walter thought about Hope humming peacefully while studying her map, about Margaret's journal entries describing a community focused on farming and traditional crafts, about birth certificates that proved legal guardianship rather than kidnapping. The disconnect between the federal agent's description and the reality he'd observed was so stark it would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. "Well," Walter said carefully, "I haven't seen any children up here, dangerous or otherwise. It's been just me and my daughter's dog since Christmas." "Mr. Jenkins," Morrison said, "we know you were a forest ranger for 30 years. You understand these mountains better than almost anyone. If this girl were trying to hide in the wilderness, where would she go?" Walter pretended to consider the question. "Depends on her skill level and what she's trying to accomplish. If she really has wilderness training, she could be anywhere within a 50-mile radius. But in weather like this, most people would head for shelter. Abandoned cabins, hunting lodges, maybe one of the old mining camps." "We've checked the obvious locations," Chen said. "We're more interested in places that might not appear on standard maps. Hidden valleys, caves, areas that locals might know about but wouldn't be documented officially. This was dangerous territory." Walter knew exactly the kinds of places they were describing, and some of them were marked on Hope's map. But admitting that knowledge would only invite more questions about how he'd come by such information. "There are stories," Walter said slowly, "handed down through generations of locals, rumors about hidden settlements, places where people supposedly went to disappear from the world. But I always figured most of it was just mountain folklore." Morrison leaned forward. "What kind of stories?" "Oh, the usual. Valleys that don't show up on surveys, trails that lead to nowhere, families that lived completely off the grid for decades without anyone knowing they were there." Walter shrugged. "Probably 90% nonsense, but in country like this, I suppose anything's possible. Your wife was Margaret Jenkins, correct?" Chen consulted his own tablet. "She did a lot of hiking in these mountains, often alone." "Did she ever mention encountering any unusual activity?" Walter's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "Margaret loved the wilderness. She'd spend whole days exploring, bringing back stories about wildlife she'd seen, interesting rock formations, things like that. But she never mentioned anything about hidden communities or suspicious activity. According to our records, Mrs. Jenkins purchased unusual quantities of medical supplies over the past several years. Antibiotics, surgical materials, items not typically needed for routine hiking accidents. Walter forced himself to look puzzled rather than defensive. Margaret was a trained nurse before she retired. She believed in being prepared for emergencies, especially when hiking alone in remote areas. She probably had enough medical supplies to run a small clinic. Morrison exchanged glances with Chen, and Walter could see they weren't entirely satisfied with his answers. But without concrete evidence, they were fishing, hoping he'd say something that would give them a new lead. "Mr. Jenkins," Morrison said, "I want to be very clear about something. The girl we're looking for has been classified as a high-priority fugitive. Anyone who aids her, even unknowingly, could face serious federal charges. Harboring a fugitive, interfering with a federal investigation conspiracy. These are crimes that carry significant prison sentences." "I understand," Walter said. "If I see anything unusual, I'll contact local law enforcement immediately." "Not local law enforcement," Chen corrected. "Contact us directly." He handed Walter a business card. "Local agencies don't have the clearance level necessary to handle this kind of threat." After the agents left, Walter stood at his window, watching their taillights disappear down the mountain road. Their SUV was equipped with more than just communication gear. He'd spotted what looked like surveillance equipment, probably capable of monitoring electronic communications in the area. They weren't just investigating. They were prepared to establish a command post, if necessary. Hope emerged from the back bedroom, her face pale but determined. "I heard everything," she said quietly. "They really think we're terrorists." "Fear makes people see threats where none exist," Walter replied, "and some people find it easier to believe conspiracy theories than to accept that there might be different ways of living peacefully. They'll keep looking for me, and if they find me here, you'll go to prison." Walter looked at the girl who'd somehow become central to his life in just 2 days. She was offering him an easy way out, a chance to turn her over to the authorities, and return to his quiet retirement. The old Walter, the one who'd existed before Scout's frantic barking had led him into the woods, might have been tempted by that option. "Hope," he said, "do you remember what I told you about having choices?" She nodded. "Well, I have choices too, and I choose to help you find a safe path forward, whatever that looks like." Walter pulled out Margaret's journals. "These contain information about other communities, other safe places where people like your family found refuge. But there's something else we need to consider." "What?" "Agent Morrison mentioned that you've escaped from federal custody 3 times. That tells me you're resourceful and determined. But it also tells me that you've been planning something beyond just running away." Walter studied her face carefully. "Hope, what were you really trying to accomplish when Scout found you in the woods?" Hope was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously moving to the pendant she wore beneath her shirt. Finally, she pulled it out, a carved wooden cross on a leather cord, intricate symbols etched into the surface. "Elder Samuel gave this to me before they took us away. He said it would help me find the other communities when I was old enough to make the journey safely." Hope traced one of the symbols with her fingertip. "These marks aren't just decoration. They're a map, a way to identify the safe places and the people who can be trusted." Walter looked at the pendant more closely, recognizing some of the symbols from the margins of Margaret's journals. His wife had been learning this symbolic language, becoming fluent in the secret communication system that connected scattered communities across the mountain regions. "Hope," Walter said slowly, "I think your escape wasn't random. I think you were following this map, looking for a specific place or person." "I was trying to reach Peaceful Valley," Hope admitted. "Elder Samuel said, if anything ever happened to our community, the people there would help children find their families or start new lives safely. But I got lost in the storm, and then—" She gestured vaguely at her bandaged side. "How did you get hurt?" Hope's expression darkened. "There were other people in the woods that night. Not agents, not searchers. They were wearing camouflage and they had night vision equipment. When they saw me, they started chasing me, and one of them shot at me. Walter felt cold fury building in his chest. Shot at you? A child? I think they thought I was carrying something important, maybe documents or information about the communities. I heard one of them shouting about recovering the intelligence materials before I managed to hide. Hope, do you still want to try to reach Peaceful Valley? She looked up at him with hope flickering in her dark eyes. You would take me there? I think, Walter said, studying the pendant and Margaret's journals, that it's time I learned more about the work my wife was really doing in these mountains. And I think you deserve the chance to reconnect with your people, if that's what you choose. Outside, snow continued to fall, and Walter began planning what would undoubtedly be the most challenging hike of his life. A journey not just through treacherous winter terrain, but through the complex landscape of federal surveillance, hidden communities, and a child's right to determine her own future. Walter spent the night studying Margaret's journals and maps, cross-referencing them with Hope's pendant and the hand-drawn map they'd found in her pocket. By morning, he'd identified what he believed was the safest route to Peaceful Valley, a journey that would take them through terrain he knew well from his ranger days, but which would be challenging even for someone with his experience. Hope had slept fitfully, awakening several times from dreams she couldn't remember clearly. Scout had maintained her vigil beside the girl's bed, occasionally raising her head to listen to sounds from outside that only she could hear. We'll need to leave before dawn, Walter explained over breakfast. The federal agents will probably set up surveillance positions during daylight hours, and we'll want to be well into the mountains before they realize we've gone. Hope nodded, but Walter could see the fear in her eyes, despite her brave facade. What if Peaceful Valley is empty? What if there's no one there anymore? Then we'll figure out what comes next when we get there, Walter assured her. But according to your pendant and Margaret's notes, that community has been stable for decades. They're good at staying hidden. As Walter packed supplies for the journey, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and Walter realized he hadn't spoken to his daughter since the agent's visit. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Dad. Sarah's voice sounded strained. I just got the strangest call from someone claiming to be FBI. They were asking questions about Scout, about whether she'd been acting unusually, whether I'd noticed anything different about your behavior. Walter felt his stomach drop. What? Did you tell them? I told them Scout was a dog, not a surveillance system, and that you'd been the same grumpy hermit you've always been. Sarah paused. Dad, what's going on? Why are federal agents asking about you? Walter looked at Hope, who was listening intently from across the room. He'd hoped to resolve the situation without involving Sarah, but the agent's inquiry changed things. They were expanding their investigation, probably monitoring his communications and preparing to question everyone connected to him. Sarah, Walter said carefully, I need you to listen to me and not ask questions right now. Can you do that? You're scaring me. I'm not in any danger, but I am involved in something that requires discretion. I need you to not come up to the cabin for a few days, and if anyone else calls asking questions about me, I need you to refer them to a lawyer and refuse to answer. Dad, Sarah, trust me on this. I'll explain everything when I can, but right now I need you to stay away and stay quiet. After he hung up, Walter continued packing with a new sense of urgency. The agents weren't just looking for Hope, they were building a comprehensive profile of everyone she might have contacted. Soon they'd be monitoring the cabin, watching for any sign of movement. Hope had been studying her pendant again, and now she looked up with an expression of sudden realization. Walter, there's something else I remembered, about the night I got hurt. What? The men who were chasing me, they weren't just random hunters or even federal agents. One of them knew my name, my real name, Hope Morning Star. He called it out. When they were trying to get me to stop running, Walter stopped packing. You're sure? Yes. And he said something about bringing her back alive for questioning. They weren't trying to capture me to return me to foster care. They wanted information. Walter, felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way that made him deeply uneasy. Hope, in your community, were there any adults who might have had information that the government would consider valuable? Names of other communities, locations of safe houses, that kind of thing. Elder Samuel kept records of everything. All the communities we knew about, the helpers like Margaret who assisted us, the routes between safe places. Hope's eyes widened. They think I know what he knew. And do you? Hope was quiet for a moment, her hand moving to her pendant. Some of it he taught me the symbols, the ways to identify safe people and safe places. He said children needed to know these things in case something happened to the adults. Walter now understood why Hope was such a high-priority target. She wasn't just a runaway child. She was a living repository of information about an entire network of hidden communities. To people like Agent Morrison, she represented a way to locate and dismantle what they perceived as a dangerous underground movement. Hope, we need to leave immediately, and we need to assume that we're being watched. As Walter finished loading his backpack with cold-weather gear and emergency supplies, Scout began exhibiting the same restless behavior she'd shown the morning she'd led him to Hope. The dog paced to the front window, looked out, then came back to Walter with obvious agitation. "What is it, girl?" Scout went to the door and whined softly, then returned to the window. Walter joined her there and carefully peered through the curtains. In the grey, pre-dawn light, he could see what had caught Scout's attention. Fresh tire tracks in the snow near the base of his driveway, and disturbed snow around several trees that suggested people had been moving through the forest around his property. "They're already watching," Walter said quietly. "We're going to have to be creative about getting out of here." Walter led Hope and Scout to the basement, where he kept emergency equipment from his ranger days. Among the stored gear was a pair of snowshoes and winter camouflage clothing that would help them blend into the forest landscape. "There's a tunnel," Walter explained, showing Hope a concealed door behind his furnace. "It leads to the old root cellar, which has an exit about 50 yards into the woods behind the cabin. Margaret insisted we have an emergency escape route. When we built this place, I never thought I'd actually need to use it." The tunnel was narrow and cold, barely tall enough for Walter to move through in a crouch. Scout seemed to understand the need for silence, padding softly behind them without her usual enthusiastic energy. When they emerged from the root cellar exit, Walter carefully surveyed the forest around them before signaling for Hope to follow. The surveillance team had positioned themselves to watch the obvious approaches to the cabin, but they'd underestimated Walter's knowledge of his own property. He led Hope and Scout through a series of natural depressions and rock formations that provided cover from observation, moving steadily away from the cabin toward higher ground. They'd been hiking for about an hour when Scout suddenly stopped, her body going rigid with alertness. Walter immediately signaled for Hope to freeze, and all three of them listened carefully to the sounds of the forest. At first, Walter heard nothing unusual. Wind in the trees, the distant call of a hawk, the soft sound of snow falling from overloaded branches. Then he caught it, the barely audible sound of voices, too far away to make out words, but close enough to confirm they weren't alone in the woods. Scout's ears were pointing toward a ridge about a quarter-mile to their east, and Walter could see her nostrils working as she tested the air for scents. "How many?" Walter whispered to Scout, as if the dog could answer. But Scout's behavior told him what he needed to know. Her attention was focused in one direction, suggesting a single group rather than multiple teams spread throughout the forest. Walter consulted his compass and the route he'd planned from Margaret's maps. They were still several miles from Peaceful Valley, and the terrain ahead would become increasingly difficult as they climbed toward the hidden settlement. If they were being tracked, they'd need to either lose their pursuers or find a way to deal with them directly. Hope tugged at Walter's sleeve and pointed toward a stand of pine trees ahead. At first, Walter didn't see what had caught her attention, but then he spotted it, a thin wisp of smoke rising from somewhere beyond the tree line. Someone had a fire going, and it wasn't far from their planned route. Walter made a decision that surprised him with its boldness. Instead of avoiding the unknown fire, he began moving toward it, reasoning that anyone camping in this remote area during a snowstorm was either very experienced in wilderness survival or very desperate. Either way, they might be allies rather than threats. As they approached the smoke source, Walter began to make out the details of a small, well-concealed camp. A lean-to shelter had been constructed against a large boulder, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The fire was small and built in a way that minimized smoke, the work of someone who understood the need to avoid detection. A man emerged from the shelter as they approached, and Walter felt a moment of shock as he recognized him. It was Doc Henderson, the local physician who'd been treating mountain families for decades. Walter had known him peripherally during his ranger years, but they'd never been close friends. "Walter Jenkins," Doc Henderson said quietly, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and concern. "Margaret said you might come this way eventually." "Margaret told you?" Walter began, then stopped as the implications hit him. "You're a part of this network. You've been helping the communities." "For 23 years, Doc confirmed, ever since a family brought me a child with appendicitis that would have killed her if she'd had to wait for official medical care." He looked at Hope with recognition. "Hello, Hope, Morning Star. I wondered if you'd made it safely out of the valley." Hope stared at the doctor with growing excitement. "Dr. Henderson, you delivered supplies to us when I was little. You taught me how to set a broken bone and treat fever. You were an excellent student," Doc said, smiling for the first time. "Samuel told me you had real potential as a healer." Walter looked between Hope and the doctor, realizing there was still much about the community network that he didn't understand. "Doc, what are you doing out here? And how did you know we might be coming this way?" "Margaret left very detailed instructions about what to do if the federal investigation ever reached a critical point," Doc explained. "She anticipated that Hope might eventually try to reach Peaceful Valley, and she wanted to make sure she had help along the way." Doc gestured toward his shelter. "I've been camping at various points along the mountain routes for the past week, watching for any sign of movement from the communities or from people trying to help them. When I saw the federal surveillance team set up around your cabin, I figured it was time to position myself along the most likely escape route." "There are others?" Walter asked. "A few. People Margaret trusted. People who believe that families should have the right to live according to their own values, as long as they're not hurting anyone." Doc's expression grew serious. "But Walter, you need to know that the situation has become much more dangerous than any of us anticipated." "How so?" Doc pulled out a portable radio and adjusted the frequency. After a moment, voices became audible, federal agents coordinating their search efforts. Walter listened with growing alarm as he heard references to enhanced interrogation, protocols, and information extraction procedures. "They're not just looking for Hope to return her to foster care," Doc said grimly. "They believe she has specific intelligence about what they're calling a domestic terrorist network. They're authorized to use whatever methods they deem necessary to extract that information." Hope moved closer to Walter, her face pale with fear. "They really think we're terrorists." "Fear and politics make a dangerous combination," Doc said. "There are people in government who see any group that chooses to live outside mainstream society as a potential threat, and there are others who are looking for ways to expand federal authority over individual families." Walter thought about Agent Morrison's cold certainty, about the way he'd described children as potential weapons. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend we get Hope to Peaceful Valley as quickly and quietly as possible. The people there have been preparing for this kind of crisis for years. They have resources and capabilities that even Margaret didn't know about." As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, Scout's ears suddenly perked up, and she began looking back the way they'd come. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of helicopter rotors. "Time to go," Doc said, quickly dousing his fire and breaking down his shelter with practiced efficiency. "They're expanding the search." Walter shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around him like a heavy cloak. What had started as a simple rescue of an injured child had become something much larger, a conflict between different visions of freedom, family, and the right to choose how to live. As they began climbing toward the higher elevations where Peaceful Valley lay hidden, Walter found himself thinking about Margaret and her secret life as a protector of unconventional families. She'd understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism was standing up to your own government when it lost sight of the values it was supposed to protect. Hope walked beside him with quiet determination, her pendant bouncing gently against her chest with each step. She was no longer just a lost child seeking shelter. She was a bridge between worlds, carrying knowledge and traditions that connected scattered communities across the mountain wilderness. Behind them, the sound of helicopters grew louder, and Walter knew they were committed now to a path that would test everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the meaning of family. Scout padded ahead of them through the snow, her golden coat bright against the white landscape, leading them toward an uncertain future, but also toward the possibility of hope finding its way home. The climb to Peaceful Valley proved more treacherous than Walter had anticipated. What should have been a 6-hour hike stretched into nearly 10 hours as they navigated around federal search teams, avoided helicopter patrols, and dealt with increasingly difficult terrain made worse by fresh snowfall and dropping temperatures. Doc Henderson had proven invaluable as a guide, his familiarity with the mountain's hidden routes surpassing even Walter's ranger experience. The older physician moved through the wilderness with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades making emergency calls to remote locations, often in weather that would challenge much younger men. "We're getting close," Doc said as they crested a ridge that offered their first clear view of the valley below. "But there's something you both need to understand before we go any further." Walter looked down into what appeared to be an empty valley, seeing nothing but snow-covered meadows and dense forest. If there was a community here, it was remarkably well hidden. "Peaceful Valley isn't just a settlement," Doc explained. "It's the coordination center for the entire network of communities throughout this mountain region. The people living here have been preparing for exactly this kind of federal crackdown for more than 30 years. Hope's eyes widened. "You mean it's like a headquarters? More like a sanctuary and a communications hub," Doc said. "When communities face threats, this is where they send their most vulnerable members and their most important resources. The federal agents are right about one thing. There is an organized network, but it's not what they think it is." Walter studied the valley more carefully, beginning to notice subtle signs of human habitation that weren't immediately obvious. Thin wisps of smoke that might be dismissed as natural phenomena, structures built so skillfully into the landscape that they appeared to be natural rock formations, and paths that looked like game trails but showed evidence of regular maintenance. "How many people are down there?" Walter asked. "That depends on what's happening in the outside world," Doc replied. "In quiet times, maybe 20 or 30 permanent residents. But when communities are under pressure, that number can swell to over 100 as families seek temporary refuge." As they began their descent into the valley, Scout's behavior changed noticeably. Instead of her usual alert caution, she seemed to relax, her tail wagging and her pace quickening as if she recognized where they were going. Hope noticed it too. "Have you been here before, Scout?" Hope asked, stroking the dog's head. Scout responded with enthusiastic tail wagging and what almost looked like a smile. "Margaret brought Scout here several times," Doc explained. "The communities believe that animals are excellent judges of character, and they wanted to make sure Scout understood this place as safe territory. The path into the valley was ingeniously designed, appearing to dead-end at several points, but actually continuing through concealed passages between rock formations. Walter realized that anyone stumbling onto this area by accident would almost certainly conclude it was impassable and turn back without discovering the hidden settlement. As they rounded a final bend, the full scope of Peaceful Valley revealed itself. What Walter saw took his breath away, not because it was primitive or crude, as Agent Morrison's descriptions had suggested, but because it represented one of the most sophisticated examples of sustainable living he'd ever encountered. Buildings were constructed using traditional techniques, but incorporated modern understanding of energy efficiency and environmental impact. Solar panels were disguised as natural rock surfaces, wind generators were built to look like abstract sculptures, and water management systems worked in harmony with the valley's natural drainage patterns. Gardens and agricultural areas were laid out in careful terraces that prevented erosion while maximizing growing space. Even in winter, he could see evidence of greenhouse structures and root cellars that would provide fresh food year-round. This wasn't a community that had rejected modern technology. It was one that had selectively adopted innovations that supported their values while maintaining independence from larger systems. "Welcome to Peaceful Valley," said a voice behind them. Walter spun around to see a woman emerging from what he'd taken for a natural cave entrance. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades of practical work. "Elder Mary," Hope breathed, breaking into a run toward the woman. "Elder Mary, you're alive!" The reunion between Hope and Elder Mary was emotional but brief. After hugging the girl tightly, Elder Mary's expression became serious as she looked at Walter and Doc. "We've been monitoring federal communications," she said without preamble. "They've classified this as a national security operation. Agent Morrison has authorization to use lethal force if he encounters what he terms armed resistance from domestic extremists." Walter felt cold dread settling in his stomach. Armed resistance? These are families with children. That's not how Morrison sees it, Elder Mary replied. He's convinced that we're training children as soldiers and adults as terrorists. Every traditional skill, hunting, wilderness survival, emergency medicine, he interprets as evidence of militant activity. Doc pulled out his radio again, tuning to the federal frequency. The voices they heard confirmed Elder Mary's assessment. Search teams were being authorized to shoot on sight any adults who appeared to be armed, and children were to be secured immediately for intensive debriefing. "There's more," Elder Mary said grimly. 3 other communities in the region have been raided in the past 48 hours. Families scattered, children separated from parents, adults arrested on various charges. The network that took decades to build is being systematically destroyed. Hope looked stricken. "What about Elder Samuel? What about the others from our community?" "Samuel is safe," Elder Mary assured her. "He's here, along with 12 other members of your community who managed to escape the initial raid. But Hope, they're all waiting to see you. They've been worried, sick, since you disappeared from the government facility." As Elder Mary led them deeper into the settlement, Walter began to understand the true scope of what he'd become involved in. This wasn't just about one lost child or even one threatened community. It was about the fundamental question of whether families had the right to choose alternative ways of life in a society that increasingly demanded conformity. The main gathering hall was built into a natural cave system, expanded and improved over generations until it resembled an underground village square. As they entered, Walter saw dozens of people engaged in various activities, some preparing food, others tending to children, still others working on what appeared to be communication equipment. At the center of the gathering sat an elderly man, with a white beard and eyes that held the deep calm of someone who'd spent a lifetime contemplating difficult questions. Hope ran to him immediately, and Walter realized this was Elder Samuel, the keeper of community records and traditions. "Hope, Morning Star," Samuel said softly, embracing the girl. "We feared we had lost you forever. I almost got lost," Hope admitted, "but Walter and Scout found me and helped me get here." She turned to Walter. "Elder Samuel, this is Walter Jenkins. Margaret the Helper was his wife." Samuel's eyes widened with recognition and something like awe. "Margaret's husband. She spoke of you often, always with great love and respect." He stood slowly, moving toward Walter with obvious intention. "Walter Jenkins, Margaret saved our people more times than we can count. She was family to us, which means you are family as well." Walter found himself unexpectedly moved by the old man's simple dignity. "Samuel, I'm sorry for your losses, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what Margaret was really doing." "Understanding often comes when we're ready to receive it," Samuel replied. "And you've come at exactly the moment when we need someone with your skills and knowledge." "What do you mean?" Elder Mary rejoined the conversation, her expression grave. "Walter, the federal teams aren't just searching randomly. They have detailed maps, coordinates, communication frequencies. Someone has provided them with inside information about our locations and operations." Doc Henderson looked shocked. "That's impossible. The number of people who know all that information could be counted on one hand." "Nevertheless, it's true," Samuel said. "Morrison's teams have gone directly to concealed entrances, hidden supply caches, emergency meeting points that took us decades to establish. Someone with comprehensive knowledge of our network has betrayed us." Walter felt the implications settling over him like a heavy weight. "You think there's an informant?" "We know there's an informant," Elder Mary corrected. "The question is who and how much damage they've done. But more immediately, we need to prepare for the possibility that they've led Morrison directly to Peaceful Valley." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching helicopters echoed off the valley walls. But these weren't the distant reconnaissance flights they'd been hearing all day. These were close, multiple aircraft coming in fast and low. "Everyone to emergency positions," Samuel called out, his voice carrying calm authority despite the crisis. "Children to the deep shelters, adults to defensive positions. This is not a drill." Walter watched in amazement as the community transformed from a peaceful gathering into a well-coordinated response team. There was no panic, no confusion, just the smooth execution of plans that had obviously been practiced many times. "Walter," Elder Mary said, gripping his arm, "you have a choice to make. You can take Hope and leave through the back trails, get her to safety while the rest of us deal with this situation. Or you can stay and help us protect what we've built here." Walter looked at Hope, who was helping younger children move toward the shelter areas with calm efficiency. Then he looked at Scout, who had positioned herself near the cave entrance as if preparing to guard it. Finally, he looked at the faces around him, people who'd spent their lives trying to live according to their values, who'd welcomed him as family because of Margaret's service to their communities. "Elder Mary," Walter said, "what exactly did you have in mind?" The sound of helicopters was getting louder, and Walter could see armed figures beginning to rappel down into the valley. The moment of decision had arrived, and whatever choice he made now would determine not just Hope's future, but the fate of an entire way of life that was about to face its greatest test. Outside, Agent Morrison's voice boomed through a megaphone, echoing off the valley walls. "This is the FBI. You are surrounded. Send out the child known as Hope Morning Star immediately, and the rest of you will be processed according to federal guidelines. Resistance will be met with appropriate force." Walter looked at Hope one more time, seeing not just a lost child, but a symbol of everything that was at stake. Then he made his choice. Walter's decision crystallized with startling clarity. "I'm staying," he told Elder Mary. "Tell me what you need me to do." Elder Mary's face showed relief mixed with grim determination. "We need someone who understands federal law enforcement procedures, someone who can help us negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than fear, and someone," Samuel added quietly, "who can bear witness to what really happens here today." Whatever the outcome, the truth of this community needs to be recorded. The helicopters had landed in the main meadow, and Walter could see tactical teams deploying with military precision. Agent Morrison's voice continued to boom across the valley, demanding Hope's immediate surrender and threatening consequences for any resistance. "Hope," Walter said, kneeling beside the girl who had remained remarkably calm despite the chaos around her. "I need you to understand something very important. Whatever happens in the next few hours, you have choices about your future that no one can take away from you." "I know," Hope replied, her hand moving to the pendant at her throat. "Elder Samuel taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid." Walter felt a surge of pride and protectiveness toward this remarkable child who'd somehow maintained her dignity and wisdom despite everything she'd endured. "Stay with the other children until this is resolved. And Hope, if something happens to me, you make sure people know that your community isn't what these agents think it is." Elder Mary led Walter to a concealed observation post that offered a clear view of the federal deployment. What he saw made his stomach clench with foreboding. This wasn't a rescue operation or even a standard arrest scenario. This was a military-style assault on what Morrison clearly believed was an armed compound. Agents in full tactical gear had established a perimeter around the entire valley, with snipers positioned on the surrounding ridges. Armored vehicles that must have been brought in by helicopter were positioned to block the obvious escape routes. Morrison had come prepared for war. "They're not planning to negotiate," Walter realized. "They're planning to overwhelm you with superior force and sort out the details afterward." "That's what we figured," Doc Henderson said, joining them at the observation post. "Which is why we've prepared our own surprise." Doc handed Walter a thick folder of documents. 30 years of legal research, federal court precedents, constitutional law analysis, and formal complaints filed with every relevant oversight agency. Margaret helped us prepare a comprehensive legal case proving that our communities operate entirely within the bounds of federal and state law. Walter flipped through the documents, recognizing the thoroughness and sophistication of the legal work. "This is impressive, but Morrison isn't going to stop his operation to read legal briefs." "No," Samuel said, appearing beside them with surprising stealth for a man his age. "But the news media might be very interested in reviewing them." Elder Mary smiled grimly and gestured toward a sophisticated communication setup hidden behind what appeared to be natural rock formations. "We've been documenting everything. The raids on other communities, the separation of children from families, the use of excessive force against peaceful people. And we've been streaming it live to news organizations and civil rights groups across the country." Walter stared at the communication equipment, realizing he'd completely underestimated the technical capabilities of these supposedly primitive communities. "You're broadcasting this? To 17 different news outlets, 3 universities with constitutional law programs, and 4 civil rights organizations," Doc confirmed. "Morrison thinks he's conducting a secret operation, but thousands of people are watching what happens here in real time." The tactical implications of this revelation began to dawn on Walter. Morrison's team had prepared for armed resistance, but they hadn't prepared for their actions to be broadcast to the world. Every decision they made, every use of force, would be documented and scrutinized by experts in constitutional law and civil rights. "Agent Morrison," a new voice called across the valley, amplified through the community's own speaker system. "This is Elder Samuel of the Peaceful Valley community. We are prepared to discuss the peaceful resolution of this situation. But first you need to understand that your actions here are being broadcast live to news organizations across the nation." The effect on the federal teams was immediate and dramatic. Walter could see confusion spreading through the tactical units as agents looked toward their commanders for guidance. This clearly wasn't a scenario they'd trained for. Morrison's voice came back over his megaphone, but Walter could hear uncertainty creeping into his tone. Cut off their communications immediately. This is a federal law enforcement operation, not a public relations event. Actually, Agent Morrison, Samuel's voice continued calmly. This is a constitutional test case that will likely be studied in law schools for decades. Every action you take here will be reviewed by constitutional scholars, federal judges, and the American public. We suggest you proceed with that in mind. Walter found himself grinning despite the tension. These communities had learned something that many law enforcement agencies struggled with, that in the modern world, public opinion and legal scrutiny could be more powerful than tactical superiority. "Sir," Walter heard one of the tactical team leaders calling to Morrison, "we're getting orders from Washington to hold position pending further review." Morrison's response was explosive with frustration, but Walter could see that the dynamic of the situation had fundamentally changed. What had been planned as a quick, overwhelming assault had become a highly visible standoff with national implications. Hope is going to be okay, Walter realized, feeling hope himself for the first time since the helicopters had appeared. They can't just take her now, not with the whole country watching. But even as he said it, Walter knew the situation was far from resolved. Morrison had invested too much in this operation to simply walk away, and desperate people in positions of authority often made dangerous decisions when they felt their credibility was threatened. The real test was just beginning. The standoff continued for 2 tense hours, with news helicopters circling at a respectful distance, and Morrison's team clearly receiving conflicting orders from Washington. Walter could see the agent's frustration mounting as what should have been a simple operation became a public relations nightmare. Then Sheriff Martinez's voice crackled over the community's radio system. "Samuel, this is Martinez. I'm at the Valley entrance with a team of local law enforcement and some federal supervisors who want to talk. Permission to approach?" Walter felt a surge of relief. Martinez had proven himself trustworthy during their earlier encounter, and his presence suggested that cooler heads might be prevailing in the federal chain of command. "Permission granted, Sheriff," Samuel responded. "We welcome the opportunity for peaceful dialogue." What emerged from the forest was a mixed group: Sheriff Martinez and 2 of his deputies, followed by 3 people in expensive suits who clearly weren't field agents. Walter recognized the type: federal supervisors, probably attorneys from the Justice Department, sent to assess the legal and political implications of Morrison's operation. Elder Mary led Walter and Doc Henderson down to meet the new arrivals, with Hope following despite Walter's attempts to keep her in the shelter area. Scout padded along beside Hope, her presence somehow reassuring in the midst of the tension. Agent Morrison, the lead federal supervisor, called out as he approached the tactical perimeter. "I'm Deputy Director Harrison from Justice. We need to discuss the parameters of this operation immediately." Morrison's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sir, this is a field operation in progress. The subjects are domestic terrorists harboring a federal fugitive." "The subjects," Harrison interrupted, "are American citizens engaged in lawful assembly on private property, and their fugitive is a 10-year-old girl who was never legally charged with any crime." He held up a tablet, showing what Walter assumed was a live news feed. "Do you have any idea what this looks like to the American public?" Walter stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to shift the narrative in Hope's favor. "Deputy Director Harrison, I'm Walter Jenkins, former U.S. Forest Service. I've been caring for the child you're looking for, and I have some information that might clarify this situation." Harrison's attention immediately focused on Walter. "Mr. Jenkins, you're the one who's been harboring the fugitive?" "I'm the one who found an injured child in the snow and provided emergency medical care," Walter corrected firmly. "A child who, according to the legal documents we've discovered, was never legally a ward of the state to begin with." Walter produced Hope's birth certificate and the custody papers Margaret had preserved. Hope Morningstar was legally placed with the Mountain Valley community after her parents died. The federal raid that separated her from her guardians had no legal basis. Harrison studied the documents, while Sheriff Martinez provided a commentary on their authenticity. Walter could see Morrison's face growing redder as the legal foundation for his operation crumbled before his eyes. Furthermore, Elder Samuel said, joining the group with his own collection of papers, we have documentation proving that every family in our network operates within federal and state law. We pay taxes, maintain legal guardianships for our children, and comply with all applicable regulations. The only thing we've done differently is choose to live according to our own values rather than mainstream culture. Hope stepped forward then, her young voice carrying clearly across the meadow. My name is Hope Morningstar, and I want everyone to know that the people who raised me aren't terrorists. They're farmers and teachers and healers who took care of me when I had nowhere else to go. They never taught me to hate anyone or hurt anyone. They taught me to love the earth and take care of other people and stand up for what's right. The impact of Hope's simple, dignified statement was profound. Walter could see it in the faces of the tactical team members, many of whom were parents themselves. This wasn't the brainwashed child soldier Morrison had described. This was an articulate, thoughtful girl speaking truth about her experience. Deputy Director Harrison looked at Morrison with obvious displeasure. Agent Morrison, based on the evidence presented here and the public scrutiny this operation has attracted, I'm ordering an immediate stand-down. All personnel will return to base pending a full review of this investigation. Sir, you don't understand the scope of the threat these people represent. Agent Morrison. Harrison's voice cut like ice. The only threat I see here is the damage this operation has done to federal law enforcement credibility. You're relieved of field command effective immediately. As the federal teams began their withdrawal, Hope ran to Walter and hugged him tightly. Does this mean I can stay with you? Does this mean I don't have to go back to foster care? Walter looked at Sheriff Martinez, who nodded encouragingly. The legal documents support your guardianship of Hope, Walter. And given the circumstances, I think the state will be very interested in ensuring her placement remains stable and supportive. Elder Samuel approached Walter with a proposal that surprised him. Walter Jenkins, you've proven yourself a friend to our communities and a protector of our children. We would be honored if you would consider serving as our liaison to the outside world, someone who understands both our ways and the requirements of federal law. Walter looked around the valley, seeing not the primitive cult Morrison had described, but a sophisticated community that had found a way to balance traditional values with modern realities. He thought about Margaret and her secret work, about Hope's courage and dignity, about Scout's unwavering loyalty to those who needed protection. I'd be honored, Walter said simply. As the helicopters lifted off and the valley returned to its peaceful quiet, Walter realized that his retirement had ended and his real life's work had finally begun. He had found his family, his purpose, and his place in a community that valued both independence and interconnection. Hope squeezed his hand tighter, and Scout wagged her tail in the afternoon sunshine, and Walter knew that some stories end not with an ending, but with a beginning. 1 year later, Walter stood on the porch of his cabin, watching Hope and Scout race through the morning snow, their laughter and barking echoing off the mountain walls in a symphony of pure joy. The scene had become his favorite way to start each day, a reminder of how completely his life had transformed since that frozen December morning when Scout's frantic barking had led him into the woods, the legal aftermath of the peaceful valley. Standoff had taken months to resolve, but the outcome had exceeded everyone's hopes. A federal investigation had cleared all the mountain communities of any wrongdoing, while Agent Morrison faced disciplinary action for exceeding his authority and misrepresenting evidence. More importantly, the case had established legal precedents protecting the rights of alternative communities to maintain their chosen lifestyles within the bounds of federal law. Hope had chosen to live with Walter rather than return to peaceful valley. Though she spent several days each month visiting the community and helping maintain connections between the scattered families. Her official adoption had been finalized 6 months earlier, making Walter not just her guardian, but legally her grandfather, a role that suited him better than any he'd ever held. "Grandpa Walter," Hope called from the yard where she was building, an elaborate snow fort with architectural ambitions that rivaled some of the community's hidden structures. "Scout says we need to check the Eastern Trail today. She's been acting restless." Walter smiled, pulling on his winter coat. Over the past year, he'd learned to trust Scout's instincts as much as Hope did. The golden retriever had developed into an exceptional wilderness companion, often alerting them to situations that required attention: lost hikers, injured wildlife, or community members who needed assistance. "All right," Walter called back. "Let me grab the emergency kit and we'll take a look." The emergency kit had become a permanent part of their hiking gear, stocked with medical supplies, communication equipment, and tools for helping people in distress. Walter's new role as liaison between the mountain communities and outside agencies had evolved into something resembling his old ranger work, but with broader scope and deeper purpose. As they set out on the Eastern Trail, Hope chatted about her plans for the day: schoolwork that could be completed online, a video call with Elder Samuel about traditional healing techniques, and evening preparation for a community celebration later in the week. Her education had become a unique blend of conventional academics and traditional knowledge, preparing her to navigate successfully in either world she might choose to inhabit as an adult. "Walter," Hope said, as they climbed toward a ridge that offered views of the entire valley system, "I've been thinking about something Elder Mary told me." "What's that?" "She said that sometimes the most important thing we can do is help other people find their way home, not necessarily to a place, but to where they belong." Hope paused to catch her breath, her words visible as puffs of white in the cold air. "I think that's what you did for me, and what Margaret did for the communities, and what Scout does when she finds people who are lost." Walter considered this as they continued their climb. Over the past year, he'd come to understand that his work with the communities wasn't just about protecting their right to live differently. It was about helping people discover and maintain authentic connections to each other and to the land they inhabited. "I think you're right," Walter said. "And I think that's what the communities do for people like us. They help us find our way to the family we're meant to have, even if it's not the family we were born into." When they reached the ridge, Scout immediately began displaying the alert, behavior that indicated she'd detected something requiring attention. But instead of the urgency that marked true emergencies, her body language suggested curiosity and welcome recognition. Following Scout's lead, they descended into a small valley Walter had never explored before, where they discovered a family setting up what appeared to be a temporary camp. A man and woman in their 30s were working together to establish a shelter, while 2 young children played in the snow nearby under the watchful eye of an older girl who looked to be about Hope's age. "Hello," Walter called out as they approached, noting how the adults immediately moved protectively toward their children. "I'm Walter Jenkins, and this is Hope. We're friends of the mountain communities." The relief on the woman's face was immediate and profound. "Thank God," she breathed. "We've been traveling for 3 days trying to find Peaceful Valley. Our community in Colorado was—" Her voice broke slightly. "We lost everything in a government raid. Elder Samuel told us to seek refuge here, but we got lost in yesterday's storm." Hope stepped forward with the natural confidence she'd developed over the past year. "You're safe now," she said simply. "We'll help you get to Peaceful Valley, and the community will take care of you until you can decide what comes next." As Walter helped the family organize their supplies for the journey to Peaceful Valley, he reflected on how seamlessly Hope had assumed the role of bridge builder between lost people and safe harbor. She had internalized not just the practical skills of wilderness living, but the deeper wisdom of community service and protection. The older girl in the family hung back shyly until Hope approached her directly. "I'm Hope Morning Star," she said, extending her hand. "What's your name?" "Faith," the girl replied quietly. "Faith River Song. I'm scared about what's going to happen to us." "I was scared too when I first came to the mountains," Hope said, her voice carrying the authority of experience despite her young age. "But I learned that being part of a real community means you're never alone, even when everything else changes." Walter watched this interaction with a deep sense of satisfaction and pride. Hope had found her calling as someone who could help other displaced children navigate the transition between loss and belonging, between fear and hope. The journey to Peaceful Valley took most of the day, but it was filled with the kind of easy conversation that develops between people who share common values and experiences. Walter learned that the Colorado community had faced the same pattern of federal harassment that had threatened Hope's original settlement. Investigations based on misunderstanding and prejudice rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. "It's happening all over the country," the father, who introduced himself as David, explained. "Communities that have existed peacefully for decades are being forced to scatter because someone in Washington has decided that alternative lifestyles constitute potential terrorism. But it's also creating connections," Walter observed. "Communities are learning about each other, sharing resources and knowledge, building networks that are stronger than any individual settlement." When they reached Peaceful Valley, the welcome the family received confirmed Walter's assessment. Elder Mary and Elder Samuel were waiting with practical assistance: warm food, dry clothing, temporary housing, and most importantly, the immediate sense of belonging that came from being accepted without question or judgment. Hope and Faith quickly became inseparable, and Walter could see that Hope had found her first real friend outside the community structure, someone her own age who understood both the losses and the possibilities inherent in their unconventional lives. As evening settled over the valley, Walter found himself sitting around a communal fire with 3 generations of community members, listening to stories and songs that connected past and future through the timeless human practices of sharing wisdom and celebrating survival. "Walter," Elder Samuel said during a quiet moment in the conversation, "Margaret would be proud of what you've become and of what you've helped Hope become." Walter looked across the fire at Hope, who was teaching Faith the community songs she'd learned as a child, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to rise naturally from the mountain air around them. Scout lay contentedly between the 2 girls, her golden coat reflecting the firelight as she maintained her patient vigil over her extended pack. "I think," Walter said slowly, "that Margaret knew exactly what she was doing when she kept her secrets from me. She was protecting not just the communities, but my own journey to understanding what family really means." Sarah had visited the mountains several times over the past year, initially skeptical about her father's new life, but gradually coming to appreciate both Hope's remarkable character and the depth of purpose Walter had discovered in his work with the communities. Her last visit had included bringing her own children to meet their unofficial sister and experience the kind of extended family structure that urban life rarely provided. "Hope has been good for you, Dad," Sarah had told him during that visit. "You're more yourself than you've been since Mom died." Now, watching Hope help another child find her place in the world, Walter understood what Sarah had meant. His identity had always been tied to protecting and serving others, but the Ranger Service had limited his scope to enforcing regulations and responding to emergencies. His work with the communities allowed him to address deeper needs, the human requirements for belonging, purpose, and the freedom to choose how to live according to one's values. As the evening wound down and families began heading to their homes throughout the valley, Hope approached Walter with a proposal that didn't surprise him. "Grandpa Walter, Faith's family is going to need time to decide whether to stay here permanently. or try to establish a new community somewhere else? Could Faith come stay with us sometimes while they're figuring things out? I think it would help her feel less scared about everything. Walter looked at the two girls, seeing in their friendship the kind of chosen family bonds that had always been at the heart of the community network. I think that's an excellent idea. Our cabin could use more laughter. The walk home through the moonlit forest felt like a meditation on transformation and gratitude. Scout ranged ahead on the trail, occasionally circling back to make sure her humans were keeping up, while Hope hummed softly, not the community songs this time, but something entirely her own that seemed to capture the contentment of a child who had found her place in the world. Back at the cabin, as Walter tucked Hope into bed and listened to her prayers of thanksgiving for family both lost and found, he realized that his story had become part of something much larger, a continuous narrative of people helping people find their way home to belonging and purpose. Scout settled into her favorite spot by the fireplace, and Walter took his evening seat in Margaret's old rocking chair, opening one of the books Hope had requested from the community library. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve, but tonight was perfect in its simple completion. Outside, snow began to fall again, but it no longer felt like a threat or an obstacle. It felt like a blessing covering the mountain, whirled in fresh beauty, and reminding Walter that every ending was also a beginning, every loss an opportunity for new discovery, and every act of love a foundation for Hope's next chapter. The golden retriever had found more than just a little girl unconscious in the snow. She had found the key to unlocking a man's true purpose and a child's rightful place in a world that had room for all kinds of families, all kinds of love, and all kinds of hope.